relevant, reliable, and researched. This is Experts on Call, the show focused on delivering leading-edge news and information on today's most beneficial products and services. This is Experts on Call on AM 650.
And we're back, and this is Talk About Strata, Experts on Call. I'm Tony Giaventi, your host. We have Pat Williams, lawyer from Clark Wilson, who is also the chair of the BC Law Institute Research Committee, with us in the studio. And we're talking about liquidation of strata corporations, which is becoming a bit of a hot topic as we're starting to see higher density and more development happening around the province. And so we're also seeing different kind of communities now that are popping up, that, we're seeing multiple townhouse stratas that are sharing facilities that are starting to look at liquidation because they're in areas where there's demand for more property, but they have lots of huge real estate. And what else are we seeing, Pat?
Well, I'm seeing what I will call mixed-use strata corporations, and that's residential as well as commercial as well as retail. And we've got a concept called airspace parcel as well. So that means that you can have more than one strata corporation, or you can have more than one form of property in the same building. So you could have retail or commercial on the bottom 3 floors of a building, and then you could have residential on floors 4, 5, and 6. And we are finding situations where the commercial entity has decided to liquidate, and now it's time for the strata corporation, which is floors 4, 5, and 6, to decide whether they want to terminate, because this 6-story building will become a 25-story building. And it could be a situation where there are other buildings around them that are similar that have already agreed. And say Metrotown, for example.
How complicated could this possibly get then?
Mm-hmm.
So for floors 4, 5, and 6, they're residential units, and they say no. As a strata corporation, we're not prepared to liquidate. So do they hold up all the other strata corporations?
I think they do.
So,
and perhaps one of the owners of 4, 5, and 6 could make an application to court to be for termination, but we don't really have that application in the Strata Property Act. You would be making new law, and regardless, a court would still have to look at what is in the best interests of the strata corporation. And a strata corporation is made up of a number of owners. And so what's in the best interest of the strata is really what's in the best interest of the owners.
Right. So it's an interesting comment, though, because you say we're making up new law. Airspace parcel agreements, for the most part, aren't really contemplated in the Strata Property Act.
No, they are not.
Right. What we're really talking about are separate properties based on separate boundaries, and which is one of the reasons why we have an ongoing research process on the Strata Property Act to essentially help it to bring it up to current status with what's happening within the structure of real estate.
Things have changed a lot in 50 years, and it's much more complicated. The buildings are more complicated. The requirements of the municipality are more complicated. And our challenge is to meet all those complications and still have an act that owners can understand. And we have actually sat at the BC Law Institute meetings and said, do we want to come up with recommended amendments that are so difficult to understand that only a lawyer can understand, or do we want to make it simple enough that an owner can understand? And the problem is, the more simple it is, the less likely it is to meet all of the challenges.
Well, and it's one of the complications that we have is you have one act and we have 28,000 strata corporations in the province.
Well, we also have the Land Act. The Strata Property Act deals with strata properties, but the Land Act deals with subdivisions.
Right.
And it's very difficult to talk about stratas without talking about subdivision.
So what happens in a scenario where, I'm thinking of a strata development in Surrey, there are 3 separate strata corporations. It's a huge townhouse development. Each of the strata corporations is about 110 townhouses, and in the middle of it, they have a recreation facility, a swimming pool and tennis courts, and you know, the development's now getting over 30 years old. 2 of the strata corporations have been in discussions with a developer over redevelopment, and because their property is so large, their recovery per unit will actually be more than their assessed values. So that it's in their interest economically in a number of ways to do it. But the third strata corporation is unwilling to even consider the discussion. Their owners don't want to consider liquidation. They don't want to consider the discussion. So we have this interconnection between these 3 properties. Is the one strata corporation going to be holding up the other 2 townhouse developments because of this joint easement that exists with all this community plan?
Absolutely. But the one thing you didn't mention is who owns the amenity facility. Typically, one strata owns the amenity facility, and all 3 stratas have a cost-sharing agreement in place along with easements. If the one strata that owns the swimming pool or the tennis court or whatever the amenity happens to be is the holdout, then the other 2 strata corporations have real issues. It's not going to happen. Whereas if one of the stratas that wants a termination owns the amenity facility, it's easier.
So we've essentially created some real complicated problems within many of these communities. It's great to have these great community plans and all these connections, but when they were being built, nobody was really thinking about, well, what's going to happen in 40 years or 50 years, and we're now at 40 years and 50 years, and we're starting to see the implications of this.
Yeah, when you first made that comment, I was sort of taken aback trying to figure out who "we" is. For a minute there, I thought you meant the BC Law Institute. But I think you were talking in the royal we.
Collectively as you know, as buyers and developers and community planners and municipalities and government, you know,
we have, and that's one of the things the BC Law Institute's trying to do with these recommended amendments, is to make it a little easier to deal with the very issues that we have created over the last 50 years.
Very interesting. So one of the issues you've also raised is the difference between commercial and residential. And you know, we're talking about 1 vote per strata lot to terminate. But in commercial, the votes are based on the proportional size of the strata lot. So if you have a strata corporation that the ground floor happens to be a supermarket or a shopping center, that commercial unit may actually have 13.5 or 28 votes, or, you know, so the proportional votes of the 80%, if the 80% is considered an amendment, is based on the total number of votes that are shown on the schedule. Is that correct?
Correct. So every residential has 1 vote. That's pursuant to the legislation.
Right.
Every commercial will have a fractional vote, and it could be 0.5, it could be 100.5.
Right.
It all depends on the size. So if you've got a mixed-use building and you've got 50% residential and 50% commercial, if you could get all of the 50% residential to agree, and one owner owns 90% of the commercial, then your task is done.
Right. Right. So when we look at the total voting schedule, and if it's mixed use, it's going to probably show some proportion, but it'll say 183.5 votes, for example. It would be 80% of 183.5.
Correct. It's not 80% of the number of strata lots. It's 80% of the total vote. And the total vote when you've got a commercial is not based on the number of lots.
Very interesting. So how do we prevent one of the phenomena that's occurred in strata corporations in the last 40 years, which is strata corporations not planning for the future? And so as a result, most strata corporations were basically living month to month, year to year off their strata fees with minimal savings. And how do we foresee that we're not creating a different problem with liquidation by now saying to strata corporations, well, look, you're not going to have to maintain and repair your buildings because in a couple of years you're just going to be able to sell them anyhow?
Well, under the Strata Property Act, there is an obligation to maintain and repair your building. We often see 3/4 votes for special levies to maintain and repair a building fail.
Right.
what they asked me as a lawyer, what do you do? And I said, hold another meeting. And they hold another meeting, and it fails again. Then they come back to me and say, what do we do? And I said, you're now in breach of the Act. You have failed to discharge your obligation to maintain your building. So there's a new section 173.1 of the Act, in which the legislation has recognized that problem. And now if you have a 3/4 vote that fails, but it gets at least a majority of the votes, then you can apply to court to have the 3/4 vote deemed to be passed. And the reason for that is because the courts have recognized the legislation, which is you have an obligation to maintain your building. You cannot let your building fall into disrepair.
Right.
Or you will be in violation of the Act. Now,
So
what if you have less than 50% voting in favor?
Right.
At that point, any owner can make an application to court that the Strata Corporation, under Section 165 of the Act, has failed in its obligation, and the court can order the repair.
You're listening to Key Pacific's Talk About Strata on Experts on Call. I'm Tony Giovento. We'll be right back after these messages with Pat Williams, who is the chair of the BC Law Institute's Research Committee on the Strata Property Act.
Delivering relevant and beneficial consumer information. This is Experts on Call. And there's more still ahead on AM 650.